We'd like to welcome you to another segment of this program called Producing for the Theater, in which we learn all facets of what happens to get it from the page to the stage. Today, we are very pleased indeed to have as our guest a gentleman named Bob Benedetti, who has been a teacher, a producer, a writer, a director, and an actor in all facets, for it would be film, theater, television, you name it, he's been there. All the years that he's put together. We will talk about what it takes to get a subscription series going for regional theater. So you will have a first-hand look, an understanding of all that it takes, all that is required, and all that we must do to get it on the stage. My name is Mike Merrick, and I'm a theater producer. And this is a continuation of our series of Producing for the Theater. I'm very pleased indeed today to have as my co-host a gentleman that I've been privileged to share your time with before. It's my good friend, Mr. Glen Cassale, who's a noted director in his own right in a couple of media, to say the least. I mean, he's so busy, I'm surprised he showed up today. And we're delighted to have him working with me. And as our special guest today, we are also quite privileged to have Mr. Bob Benedetti. Now, you've all heard the expression, I think, he wears two hats, or he wears three hats. Well, I think Bob Benedetti may wear 7 or 8, because Bob Benedetti, who's not only a teacher of theater, a teacher of film, I mean, he was head of the Yale Drama School, to say the least, Carnegie Mellon, etc. But he is a man
the acting
who was,
department at the
well, the
Yale
acting
Drama
department.
Bob Brustein would not like to hear that.
Yeah, but I like to build it up a little bit.
Okay.
You know, why not? I don't know Bob Brustein, I know you. But nevertheless, he has also been a writer, a producer in television and film, a novelist of some measure and some note. So we're very pleased to have him here today to talk about the relationships between producers, directors in film, theater, and all the differences inherent within all that media. And you, Bob, if I may say, as an individual who has been terribly active with hands-on, not only working directly with that media, but teaching about it now, I think is a perfect subject for us to deal with.
Sure.
Glenn? Would you?
Yes, you know, I also think that, you know, through the years of your experience, I'd also like to talk a little today about the changes in the theater between the producer and the director over the years. Because obviously, as you know, Mike, over the years, that whole media has changed. New York theater and theater of the whole country.
Regional theater especially, yeah. Without a question of a doubt.
Yeah, I remember in the 50s and 60s, there were great dreams, as you will recall, about what the nascent regional theater movement was going to do for theater in this country, give playwrights a home to develop, give actors ongoing developmental experiences, build audience relationships within communities, you know, the hometown team kind of feeling, all the belief that we had when Danny Newman started the subscription series idea.
Subscribe now.
And sad to say now, in hindsight, it didn't happen.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think it's mainly an economic problem. When Tyrone Guthrie selected Minneapolis for the home of the Guthrie Theater, which was probably the most ambitious and the most famous experiment in the starting of a regional repertory theater in the European model, because we looked to Europe and we saw what regional theaters did there, and we honestly believed that the same thing could happen here. And Guthrie was someone who had come out of that milieu, who came to America. He surveyed a number of cities. Chicago was one, Cincinnati, I know, was one, and there are several others. And he chose Minneapolis. It was interesting. Why? He said that he chose Minneapolis because it was a homogeneous community, being settled mostly by, settled mostly by Danish people?
And Dutch,
Scandinavian.
Scandinavian.
Right?
The whole culture,
Garrison Keillor, forgive me.
Right.
Harrison Keillor.
That he thought that kind of homogeneity in a community was necessary for the long-term support of a major arts organization, be that a symphony orchestra, an opera company, ballet company, whatever. And for many years he was proven right. The Guthrie did very well. It flourished, still flourishes. And as we had hoped, it spawned a great many other theaters. Before the Guthrie, there was very little theater in Minneapolis. There was the Children's Theater of Minnesota, which is still an important theater. But beyond that, there was very little. But a few years after the Guthrie was going, suddenly there were a fairly large number of other theater organizations at work in the city.
Also throughout the United States, if I may,
Well, when I left Chicago, I grew up in Chicago. I ran the theater at the University of Chicago, what later became the Court Theater. And I was in Second City in the early 60s. But when I left Chicago in the mid-60s, there was almost no theater. And now it's one of the liveliest,
one of the top, without a question.
Steppenwolf,
the
and
Goodman,
Bridge,
etc. Right.
Right. So we very much believed that theater begat theater, but that it hasn't, with the exception of a few cities like Seattle, Chicago, and New York, and Los Angeles, the idea of the regional theater has not caught on. The theaters that have done well do not bear the mark of a region. They don't have that kind of immediate relationship to their community that we hoped that the theaters would have, as they do in Europe. I remember years and years ago, Megan Terry moved out of New York and went to Omaha to start a theater of her own called the Magic Theater. And I asked her, Megan, what in the world are you going to Omaha for? And she said, I need to work in a town which I can hold in my mind, where the whole town, the identity of the town, can be in my mind, and I can relate to it as if I were relating to another person. And the Magic Theater lasted a long time, did some very important work. And that was what we hoped for. But I think the truth is that America is a nomadic culture. The average American family moves every 2.4 years or something like that. And with all the problems of the inner cities and now the redevelopment going on, we tried in Los Angeles with the Los Angeles Theater Center to start a theater in the really the worst part of the downtown area as the keystone of a civic revitalization of the downtown area. It didn't work. So I think it's a reflection of our what's the word? I don't want to say dysfunctional, but it's a disparate.
Probably is, though.
Well, it's a disparate. We don't have communities, as they say of Los Angeles, and I think it's true, having now lived there for a lot of years, that there is no there. That with the lack of what Guthrie was looking for, with the lack of strong local sense of identity of and sense of community, it's very difficult for arts organizations to be supported by their immediate community. The Denver Center Theater is on very hard times. Mummers Theater of Oklahoma, which was a wonderful place, stopped altogether as far as I know. And so the dependency remains on the government, and Lord knows that our government has been very unreliable
You're talking
in
about
this
the special
regard.
government that we have now, or generally speaking?
Generally speaking,
Well,
we have never done well.
Certainly compared to
And-
Europe, we haven't done well.
No, and
Because they
now
don't
we're
believe in
doing
the
even
arts.
worse than
Well,
we were.
Without getting into that, you're right.
State governments are so strapped that
Of
they
course.
don't have the wherewithal to help. Corporations, ever since the so-called tax reforms and the expectation that tax reform was going to cause the private sector to somehow rush in to fill the vacuum created by the withdrawal of federal support, hasn't happened. So they're left depending on the box office.
Yeah,
So
well.
I think that most theaters depend on the box office for 70, 80% of their support, in the same way that universities depend on tuition for 60, 70, 80% of their support. And that drives you into a consumerist mentality that makes you choose only proven products, only the evergreens, only the stuff that is the flavor of the
Recognized.
month, and that's understandable.
That's a tragedy, but let me interrupt you as a theater producer. Glenn knows about it because Glenn and I have talked about it. If you want to bring a show on the road, a new show, for example, that has great merit, that's been done in workshop, that's been tried out, etc., a lot of the so-called road bookers who book big theaters, or even the big theater people, they don't want to know from it. They want Wicked, they want something
The
they
show
want Spamalot.
Wicked. The show Wicked.
The show Wicked, of course, the big musical Wicked.
Right.
But the point is, when you have a government that limits the amount of money that is expended toward the National Endowment for the Arts, for example, and you talked about Los Angeles. Well, Gordon Davidson, who left the CTG about a year and a half ago, and was replaced by a guy who I think is absolutely terrific, named Michael Ritchie, comes from Williamstown. They have another problem now with the Mark Taper Forum and the amuse. And the problem is that Los Angeles, that people who used to come from the Pacific Palisades and get downtown to Figueroa Street or wherever they are in a half an hour, excuse me, now take an hour and a half or 2 hours to drive. So they're
yes.
looking, I mean, that's, and I know because I spoke
important.
with Michael Ritchie to come over something of that nature. So all these things, it's like a plot against creative people who want to do good things. How do you develop new theater?
But you know, let me just follow up on that a little bit. I think that what you guys are talking about is right, but also it's become a monetary thing. The amount of money for a husband and wife to go out to the theater for a night on a Friday night in Los Angeles is almost $250 to $300 for one night of theater, and if you have 4 children. So you're right about the government. I think the government should come in and subsidize so there are tickets available for students. We've got to create an audience, and that's what I try to do when I direct, is say, let the students come in and look. Let them get their taste of what it's like to go to the theater. I mean, down at the Mark Taper, they have that Pay What You Can Day that they continue to do,
Which is very
that
good.
I think is terrific. You go that day, there isn't a seat.
Now, by
But
the
of course,
way,
they've also had to cancel their Hispanic writers program and their
Because of
African-American
funding.
program.
that Gordon initiated.
Yes,
Because of
right?
funding.
That
And
were
they
very
blame Ritchie
important.
for it, which is not fair. But I'll tell you what they're doing, and I don't know where they're getting the money for it. They're closing down the Mark Taper Forum next spring of '07
To
for
renovate
almost
it.
a total renovation, rejuvenation. Costs a lot of money.
But I
they
think
do it.
that's city and state funds.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is. It's not federal.
And buildings are a little bit easier to create money for. Back in the 50s, we used to speak of the edifice complex, where there was a lot of money available to build these theaters. And if they had only taken 10, 15% of the building fund and endowed it as an operating fund, I think we'd have a lot more theaters still running. But people don't want to give money for their name to be on an operating fund. They want their name on bricks and mortar.
Absolutely.
One of the best working experiences I ever had was in Australia at the Melbourne Theatre Company. There they have 85 actors, and at least they did when I was there, 85 actors on year-round contracts. These actors own houses, they have cars and children and everything that middle-class people are supposed to have. They keep their ticket prices extremely low. If you've got 4 children at home, you call the theater and they will provide a babysitter from their docents, from their people. They'll help you out on transportation. They do everything they can to make it enjoyable and possible for middle class, working class people to come to the theater, and the government subsidizes that pretty heavily, both the state and the federal government there. We need to think about reaching out more. This was a thread in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s. Joe Papp at the New York Public with the Spanish-speaking Shakespeares that would go on into Spanish Harlem. Going into prisons, going into community centers, going to schools so that more children, not enough children experience live theater in this country in their early years, so that we're not building audiences for the future. I think we need to all, and the government as well as the theater operators, need to think more about institutional image building, about long-range audience development. I used to be on a panel in Washington, D.C. That gave advice of sorts. And I remember I came up with an idea. In ancient Greece, when they would hold the big festivals, it was considered to be a civic duty to attend the theater, because it was, after all, an offering to the god, and everybody was supposed to participate in that. But at the same time, because they revered and respected the theater art, they didn't think that it should be given away for free. Everybody had to buy a ticket. If you couldn't buy a ticket, the ticket would be purchased for you. There had to be a ticket because you had to make a commitment. This had to cost you something, at least symbolically. So there was a thing called the Lycurgian Fund, named after Lycurgus, who was the city manager of Athens at that time. And that fund was used to buy tickets for poor people and for prisoners, because even the prisoners were let out of prison on the day of the festival to attend, or at least
there are a lot of escapes that week.
Yeah, right. And that idea of the Lycurgian Fund, of a fund that said, well, theater is worth paying for, but if you can't afford it, then pay what you can, in that spirit. I remember running the theater at the University of Chicago, which is on the south side of Chicago, in a fairly poor area. I misguidedly would give students free tickets, and they'd sometimes come and behave very badly. And I asked some of them once who were fooling around, I said, doesn't it mean anything to you that you're getting to see Romeo and Juliet or whatever it was that they were seeing? Because we did mostly Shakespeare. And I realized by their answers that these street kids were not dumb. They knew that if something was free, it was probably not worth it. So I started charging a quarter, 50 cents, the cost of a pack of cigarettes then. And suddenly, not only did we get more kids, but the behavior was entirely different because they had made a commitment. Well, I proposed to the federal government, let's set up something like the Lycurgian Fund. We already have the mechanism to do it, food stamps. We're always saying that theater is as important as bread and wine. Let's allow people who are on food stamps to redeem their food stamps at the box office for theater and music and ballet. And see that the Marxist critics are right. Art will always reflect the taste of whoever's paying the bills.
That's right.
If that's the Ford Foundation, it'll be Ford Foundation art. If it's the NEA, it'll be NEA art. If it's the Medici's, it'll be Medici art. Let's let the poor distribute the subsidy by using their food stamps, by redeeming their food stamps at the box office. Maybe the theaters would be more motivated to offer stuff that the proletariat wants to come and see, because so of course everybody chuckled and smiled, and that was the end of that idea. But it's still a principle that I am passionate about, and if I ever have the opportunity to operate a theater, I'm going to enact something like that kind of a program.
Well, you know, I've been working in Holland the last couple of years, and this producer over there, his name is Joop van Ende, his mission is to do just that. He really feels if there's a child who wants to go to theater, he will subsidize that ticket. And he does it to any school children that want to go to the theater, that can't afford it, he will subsidize it. Now, he can afford it, he's got enough money, but also he's into this same thing. He feels that the community should feel that they own the theater, that they participate in the theater, to the point where he put chairs in the lobby, 6 chairs, building a new theater, and let the audience sit in the 6 chairs and vote on the one that they wanted. So now when they come back to the theater, they're going to believe they own it.
Yeah, there was a great theater in Lyon, France in the 60s run by a guy named Jacques Planchon, who used to have town meetings every year to pick the season.
Really?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And
it's true democracy in the theater, isn't
They do it in Sacramento.
And really?
Every summer, as you walk out, they have the next year's list, and you pick.
Oh,
what
great.
you want to see?
And they make it seem, and they do, they pick 5 out of the 7 are their choice,
Okay.
and 2 are artistic choice.
Excuse me, let me ask you a question pertaining to that, Glenn. You say they have a list. How do you list unknown, untried, brand new work?
You list the 5 that are the big box office, My Fair Lady, Camelot, whatever they are. Then the last 2 you're going to say, A Boy's Life, or whatever the title is, new work. They're already on the subscription because they bought the 5 plays that they picked. So you're going to teach them with the new plays.
Donovan Marley, who ran a theater in California called PCPA, Pacific Conservatory of the Performing Arts in Santa Maria and Solvang for many years, and then who took over the Denver Center Theater and ran it very successfully for a lot of years. He had a formula that I thought was exemplary. They do a 7-show season, and he always spoke of anchoring the season in 2 or 3 plays, usually 2 musicals and 1 evergreen, you know, Death of a Salesman or Glass Menagerie, something like that. And then there'd be 2 somewhat challenging plays, but still of good reputation, and then 2 completely unknown new plays. And his theory was that you'd pull the people in with the evergreens and the you know, popular ones, and you would elevate their taste, and gradually over a period of years, you would be elevating the taste of your subscription audience, and that was the reason for having subscriptions.
Absolutely.
So that you could educate your audience. Now, subscriptions are problematical now. I can't buy a subscription and tell you 6 months in advance what night I'm going to come to the theater because we're traveling. And
But nevertheless, theaters throughout the United States are to a great extent dependent upon subscriptions. If a producer wants to do a new work and try it out, and not necessarily utilizing that phrase, but let's say introduce it to the public prior to going big commercial, Broadway, etc., he, and I can speak for myself, and I'm sure many, many, many others, absolutely salivates at the idea of a strong subscription, because you know that, let's say you're going for 3 weeks, your first 2 weeks, 70% will be taken care of. I mean, that's a wonderful attraction to develop new work, to get audiences to come in.
Well, the 2 things that are on the bad side of subscriptions. One is if you do have a big hit, you can't extend the run because you've got to vacate the theater for the next show and the subscription to come in. And there's been a lot of big hits in regional theaters which could have supported the theater into its old age if they had been able to extend the run, which is why if I were running a regional theater, I'd have another stage somewhere that I could move things like that into. I'd also have an arm to translate some of these successes into television commodities. I'm really amazed that the regional theaters in this country don't all have a producing arm they've got the sets, they've got the costumes, they've got the actors. Why not create a television show of the majority of shows in each season that could become television? Because there's a tremendous
That's becoming more and more
hunger.
popular. I mean, I think that's become. They've already approached us with this Judy Garland show about filming it because now there's so much airtime.
Yeah.
They need product.
Yeah.
You're right. I think that's our future.
Right,
That is
right.
our future if we can connect into that. I mean, the Peter Pan video we did, went out, we did it, it went on TV. I mean, it was really successful. And again, hit a market that when we went back out, they all knew that video. That's why we're selling so well.
What you say about subscription money is true. We've been hard hit by inflation in the theater, though, because steel and wood and fabric and printing and a lot of the commodities that we depend on have increased in cost beyond, quite above the rate of inflation in general.
There's another descriptive you left out. It's a word called greed, which is because, no, it's true. You can't just blame the unions, but nevertheless, because those commodities have increased in cost without a question of a doubt, rather than increasing it just subliminally, if you will, they have said, well, we'll increase it double the amount, etc. As you just said before, Glenn, you can't afford to go to the theater.
Well, I wrote a book about producing for film, and it starts with the statement that the producer is the traffic cop at the intersection of art and commerce. And
Very good, I like that.
And because it's our job to take the available resources and put them to the best creative use by identifying and respecting and understanding the vision, the thing that makes this show worth doing. And then above all, make sure that we get a lot of bang for the buck, that every dollar we've got ends up on the screen or on the stage in the service of that central vision without allowing ourselves to get derailed or drawn off the scent by easy production values or star names or anything else that doesn't serve the central vision, the human event that this play can become. And to make sure that everyone that we hire to work on that play is the right person to be working on that play and has the wherewithal necessary to do their best work. If we can do that, we're really doing our job as a producer. And sometimes that requires us to make really difficult decisions about limitations. I have a friend who's running a theater now that's in a lot of trouble, and they started to cut back across the board, sets, no more equity actors, reducing the size of the company. This is a theater at a university, in a university setting. And but nowhere in these cutbacks was there a reflection of the specific needs of the particular plays that they were doing. And my argument to him is, pick a season that you can do. I remember Bill Ball did this when ACT ran into trouble. He opened with the Gin Game. He picked a season of stuff that they could afford to do well. And
Well, it's a two-hander, and et cetera, right?
And unfortunately, it's pretty tough to get a show with more than 8 people in it done in the regional theaters in this country now, because we just didn't inherit the Wind that I directed here in Las Vegas, has a cast of 26, plus a lot of extras in the original version. Who can afford to do that show?
Well, one of the interesting things is we spoke a few moments ago about CTG and Michael Ritchie, who succeeded Gordon Davidson. Michael Ritchie's, I think, first production when he took over the season was Dead End. 50 people in Dead End. 50. Then you know what he did? First of all, he had to build a pool into the pit at the Amundsen, which he did. And then he went to Equity, which I give him a great deal of credit for, and said, look, we want to do this show, here's what we need, you have to waive your certain minimums. He went to the universities, to USC, to UCLA, and said, I want your students to come in, rehearse for 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it was, appear in the show for, I think it was for about 4 weeks, and to get a credit. And the universities reacted in the most positive way, and the kids loved it. So he had his cast of 50, utilizing the leads, the guy who played the gangster, whatever his name was, et cetera, and was able to tenant it with those kind of people by using imagination.
Yeah.
That's what we need today. We need guys like that, like the Richies and people of that caliber, young guys who come in and say, wait a minute, let me get around it. Let me not diminish the quality of the show, but let me find out how I can keep the quality and at the same time be reasonably, fiscally responsible.
Yeah.
And I feel as a director over the last few years, you really have to be aware of the monetary. What's happening monetarily all around as a director. And you have to make your choices of what matters to you. And you have to make those choices nowadays. You go out on a tour, I put these tours out, and I hear, this is where the budget is, this is what the budget is, this is what the budget is, and you realize that if you don't do that, it's not going to survive.
When I stopped doing theater after over 30 years and started doing movies, it was as a producer. It was a great awakening to me to see the process by which budgets and planning are done for movies, because we don't really approach it as well in the theater as they do in the movies. Maybe because there's not as much money involved.
Well,
but
it's also changed, though. You know, I mean, I think you're right. Movies talk about above the line, below the line, but in theaters, what you have to do is address: can I break even at 60% of capacity?
Yeah.
If I can't break even at 60% capacity, I'm crazy. I've said, 90% will break. Well, I mean, if you're dependent upon filling a house to make a little bit of money, you're crazy.
yeah.
Am I right, Bob?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Sure.
definitely.
But in movies, they'll take the script, and my daughter used to do this for her profession. She was an estimator. There are people whose specialty is to take a script and translate it into a budget. And they're uncannily correct, you know, without even considering how is the director going to shoot this, how many crane days do we need, how many extra days, and these budgets come out, and then a decision is made. Well, is that budget reasonable? If it's not, we go back to the script.
Yeah, but you're not talking about fees for the stars and the actors. You're talking about what's,
Well,
below the line.
Right? Yeah, but there's an above the line allowance where there's a sense of what
capacity
of what the top dollar, what the top of the show is going to be.
Right.
We're not going to be able to pay more than $1 million for this role or more than $500,000 for that role. So there is a sense of the maximum above the line. Now, if the financing entity becomes convinced that the participation of a particular star or a particular director or even a particular writer, although in America directors and writers count for a lot less than actors, unlike Europe where directors are worth more. But if they're convinced that the participation of that person is going to enhance the revenue capability of the project, then they'll be willing to break the budget, to break that line of the budget. So it's always on a quid pro quo kind of basis. But what I admired about it was going back to the script and saying, well, we got too much night shooting. That's too expensive. We'll turn some of these scenes into day. And so that you start out with a conception and a piece of material that is doable well within the boundaries of your financial capacity. And that's something that I think theaters could do better
absolutely
than they do
absolutely
at present.
right.
I also think over the last 20 years, we've gotten less away from letting the audience have their imagination.
Yeah.
Which has put our budgets up.
Yeah.
Because we feel if we need a waterfall there, we've got to build a waterfall.
We overproduce like crazy in this country.
And what happens is the production values become the play rather than the actors and the emotion that's supposed to be there. You see this big set, which is a lot of the money. You go, well, wait a minute,
that's why it costs so much damn money in New York, for example. Take a look at Las Vegas, which I think is a joke saying the Las Vegas is the new Broadway. Las Vegas is not the new Broadway. What Las Vegas is doing, I think it's wonderful. What they're doing is they're bringing in certain musicals, Hairspray, Phantom, their version, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Because audiences are spending all that money and they want spectacle. They don't really want theater with a capital T. They want to see, it's like going to the circus.
Well, I think that's the big question. Is theater in our culture has it become an elitist form. The last survey that I saw in New York, which was a long time ago, done a long time ago, was that 85% of the theater tickets were purchased by 6% of the population. So has the theater painted itself into a corner to the point where we're appealing only to a very thin sliver of the population in general? And if so, we're screwed, because that's a cycle. That's a self-fulfilling thing. And unless we start getting young people into the theater, unless we start creating a theater-going mentality and theater-going habits in this country, and a sense of identification with the theater, which is what we don't have. I mean, Las Vegas, yes, you can spend $140 million staging a thing because you've got new people coming in every week. You've got that. It's a tourist industry.
Sure.
There was an argument. I used to be an advisor to the Canada Council when I taught in Canada, and the argument there was that the Stratford, Ontario Shakespeare Festival and the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, which tended to get like 75 or 80% of the total arts budget of Canada for those two operations, that they really ought to be transferred into the Department of Tourism, because the fact was that they generated a lot of tourist dollars, a lot of transportation dollars. The same argument was made, I forget by who, maybe by Danny Newman in America, that if you look at the National Endowment for the Arts, but the amount of money, each dollar that the NEA spends, like 40% of that dollar goes for transportation for artists and moving stuff around. Another 25% goes for this. And
per diems and things like that.
a tiny percentage goes to the artists. So our sense of subsidy in this country is kind of cockeyed.
Well, there is. The only encouragement I get is that the theater has been called the constant invalid, or whatever you will, for how many decades and years, and we were dying in the 30s, etc. What do you think that an actress like Julia Roberts, who's going on Broadway for 15 weeks, a limited run, I don't know how they're going to make money, with a cast of about 7 or 8, what do you think somebody of that caliber, of that status, from film, does for the theater?
Well, I have two opposing feelings about it. A lot of people that I've had privilege of teaching or have gone through programs that I ran, you didn't mention I used to be dean of the theater school at Cal Arts, where Ed Harris and Don Cheadle and these are people who have maintained their commitment to live theater and will go back and do live theater on a regular basis. I know Al Pacino came out of the Theater Company of Boston, and Day Wheeler's operation had it in his contract, that in his movie contracts, his studio contract, that he had to be available a certain number of weeks of the year to do live theater, because these are the kinds of artists who recognize that their vitality as artists requires getting back there in front of an audience. So that kind of person doing that kind of thing, I say more power to them, God bless them, that they're utilizing their bankability to help support that which gave them their start, their birth as artists, and that which can provide for them ongoing artistic development. Because in the movies, you pretty much get hired to do what you already know how to do. And if you want to expand yourself, I used to run Ted Danson's production company for 5 years at Paramount, and Ted was always wanting to expose his dark side, to do roles like the one that was important in the early part of his career, when he played an incestuous father.
Oh yeah.
And he won an Emmy for it. And everybody said, "Oh, you're going to kill your career if you do this." He wanted to do that kind of work again. It was very, very hard to even get submission of good scripts that weren't designed for that public persona that is attached to every star.
Yeah, Cheers.
You know? So I think stars become trapped by the persona The old studio system recognized that and would develop, would exploit. They had what they called the exploitation department, which would sort of develop a persona for each actor, and that's what was sold.
Well, they were movie stars. They weren't really actors.
That's right.
Anymore,
There is a difference between a movie star and an actor. When you happen to be both, and you want to keep yourself alive as an actor while you're a movie star, it requires a lot of sacrifice. So when that's what's happening, I say bless them and wonderful.
Well,
but when a theater hires, and especially not so much a New York theater, but some regional theater, hires a name actor just for the sake of the revenue that that actor will produce, just for the marquee value.
Stunt casting.
That kind of stunt casting, I think, is injurious and insulting to the other artists in theater who sit there and say, I'm better than that. I could do that better than that. How come he or she is getting to do that instead of me?
You're 100% right. I mean, as a guy, as a producer who's trying to get things on the road, I've worked in England a lot, as Glenn knows. And I'm doing a show there that I started here at the university late this year, early next year, a musical called Almost Like Being in Love about Lerner and Lowe.
Oh,
and
great.
every theater says, well, who's going to play Lerner and who's even there? All of a sudden, they were never like this before. They're manifested. They're concentrating on that. I read an article, an interview with Kate Blanchett, the actress. I never knew that she had an extensive theater background. She's doing Hedda Gabler at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Harvey Theater, etc.
Right.
She made a comment, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that when you're acting in film, and you certainly would be familiar with this, it's piecework.
Yeah.
You're doing little pieces here and then you're putting it all together. But when you're acting in the theater, it's like surfing a wave and you're using all your muscles. I thought it was a very poetic kind of a description. Now there's an actress who's become a big name in movies who still goes to the theater.
Bless her. Yes.
Don't you think that more British actors play the theater more? And
I think in both Britain and Australia there is...
Well, you've worked in Australia extensively, yeah.
There is a tradition of crossing over, partly because the pay scale difference between film and theater is not as great as it is here in America.
Yeah.
I mean, here in America, if I'm an actor and I'm going to sit there and wait for my agent to call because I know that 2 weeks of film work is going to pay me more than a year of theater work. You can sort of understand why there's 110,000 members of the Screen Actors Guild sitting around waiting at their telephones. Whereas in England and Australia, the difference in the amount of pay that you can make in live theater and in film in those countries, film still pays more, but not that much more. Not so much more that a young artist would be encouraged to forego working in the theater just for the sake of pursuing exclusively film opportunities. So there is a tradition of doing both theater and film. If you're a serious actor, my buddy Patrick Stewart is constantly striving to go back into theater, and because he's had so many years of success on Star Trek and in the other shows here in America, he was desperate to go back to England to appear not only in his own version of the Christmas Carol, a one-man show of the Christmas Carol, which is extraordinary, but now he's about to do both Prospero and Antony with the Royal Shakespeare Company.
And he can afford it.
Well, yes, now he can afford it.
Okay.
And he could afford it then because he's a founding member of the Royal Shakespeare Company. But he was desperate to go back to England to show his peers there, not so much the public, but his peers, that he was still a real actor.
Yeah, right.
And the only way to do that was on the stage. So that sense of respect for the theater, for your theater credentials, in Hollywood, we sometimes, like, I don't tell anybody when I was working as an actor or when I started producing, I don't let them know that I've got a PhD in theater. I don't tell them that because they're all out of some corporate culture, or and they would regard me as untrustworthy.
Professorial.
Yeah. And I think that there is this sheepishness, this lack of respect for the theater as the mother art, and by God, this is where it's at. So that after 15 years of making movies, I felt that I really needed to get back to making theater, not only as a director, but as a teacher. Because as much as I love movies, and I think movies are the religion of our culture, I mean, if there is a tabernacle that contains the essence of what it is to be an American, it lives in the movies. Nevertheless, I recognized that I was going stale. I was cut off from my own creative roots. And I was also disgusted with the movie business, because the kind of show, usually shows about social justice, about civil rights in some form or another, are increasingly difficult to get set up as a producer. And I didn't want to do the kind of crap that they're looking for now, and I just lost the faith.
I understand
But
that.
you know what? I think it's an education on a lot of levels, because I also talk to agents who don't want their clients who do want to do the theater.
Absolutely right.
Won't let them.
Yeah.
George Clooney did one of my first shows I did in L.A. We were a hit. We wanted to extend for a year. The agents didn't want them. George Clooney and Mark Harmon argued with them about staying in that 99-seat theater for a year, and they did.
Well, Clooney is a very unusual kind of guy.
Yeah.
Take a look at the quality of the work that he
Of
does.
course, but this was early on.
I know.
mean, he was doing Attack of the Killer Tomatoes.
You got to give, hey.
But don't forget that actors never feel actors never feel like they've arrived. I don't care how big a star you are. An actor between engagements feels like they will never work again. And when their agent tells them you can't take yourself out of the stream for a whole year, they'll forget about you.
They get nervous.
The actor justifiably gets nervous, because there's a little truth in that.
But then you see, you take an actor like David Schwimmer, who made a tremendous amount of money on Friends. I give him a lot of credit. He did a play in London, and now he's doing Camp Mutiny Court Martial on Broadway.
Yeah,
now
good for him. He went to Northwestern, my alma
He did.
mater.
Well, there you are. Okay.
And he's worked at the Geffen.
Yeah.
I
You
mean,
get
he did a
guys
show at the
you get
Geffen.
guys like that who
Yep.
do want to do theater, who say, I have a responsibility to the craft and to myself.
Yeah, here.
A lot of people don't feel that way. I got to give Julia Roberts a lot of credit. She didn't have to do it. She's going in and doing this play because did she ever do theater? I don't even know anything about it.
I have no idea.
I don't have no idea. I don't have an idea either. But nevertheless, whatever, she's a big movie star.
But you know what I think about that? I think with Julia Roberts being on Broadway, it will open up a new crowd.
It's good for Broadway.
Because they'll want to go see Julia Roberts. Now, whether
Absolutely.
she succeeds or not, I'm not sure. But it'll open up a whole new crop of people that'll want to go for theater dollars.
And that's to the good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think we have to end this discussion at the moment. I'd like to thank our guest, Bob Benedetti, a man who I said earlier wears many, many hats, for his wonderful contribution to the show, and my co-host, of course, Glen Cassale, for producing for the theater. We look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with all the extensive information that is always a learning process in producing for the theater. Thank you, and we'll see you again.